You are listening to The Soul's Quiet Call, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Chapter 22, The Awakening Heart. The evening was heavy with the scent of rain, a dampness in the air that seemed to seep into every corner of Meera's flower shop. The soft light of the hanging bulbs cast a warm glow on the delicate petals of the flowers she had arranged that afternoon, but tonight, there was no comfort in the beauty of her surroundings. She stood by the counter, her fingers absently caressing the edges of a bouquet, her thoughts far from the colorful blooms around her. Something had shifted, something deep within her, and she couldn't place exactly when or how it happened. All she knew was that her heart felt heavier than usual, burdened by an unfamiliar sensation, a feeling that she had somehow missed something crucial, something she'd been blind to for far too long. It was then that the familiar hum in her chest began again, that subtle pulse that signaled her gift was awakening. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't Aarav's heart that called to her. It was her own. Meera's breath caught in her throat as her vision blurred. In an instant, she was no longer in the flower shop, no longer surrounded by the delicate fragrance of roses and lilies. Instead, she was in the quiet recesses of her own mind, flooded with images, visions of herself, moments of her life, feelings she had long kept buried. Her own desires, her own fears, unfurled before her like a long-forgotten secret. She saw herself as a child, standing in the corner of her family's home, watching as others laughed, as they shared their joy with one another. But she had never truly been part of that world, had she? Always an observer, always someone who could never quite connect with the others because she saw too much, knew too much, and in the end, was left alone with her gift. She saw the smiles, the laughter, the relationships others had so easily formed, and she felt the chasm between them, the hollow ache in her chest that had never quite healed. And then came the fear, the deepest, most raw fear that had always haunted her. The fear that she would never be loved for who she truly was. That people would never see her, not as the girl who could read hearts, not as the one who could understand their every thought, but as Meera. The woman who carried a gift that distanced her from others, the woman who had never learned how to love without the crutch of her abilities. Her chest tightened as she recognized the truth that had eluded her for so long. She had been sabotaging her own happiness. She had built walls around herself, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid that if she showed the world who she really was, they would see her as too much, too different. She had hidden behind her gift, using it to shield herself from the pain of rejection, but in doing so, she had only pushed people away. And now, in the quiet of her shop, with her own heart laid bare before her, she understood that it wasn't just Aarav who had walls around him. She had them too, walls she had built herself, to protect herself from the loneliness that had become her constant companion. The vision began to fade, and Meera blinked back the tears that had begun to well in her eyes. Her breath was shaky, and for the first time in a long while, she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that terrified her. Meera? Aarav's voice broke through the stillness, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his eyes soft with concern. His presence was a comfort, but at the same time, it made the weight of her emotions feel even heavier. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't ready for this conversation, but the realization that had just swept over her was too powerful to ignore. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Aarav stepped into the room, his footsteps careful, as though he were trying not to disturb the fragile moment. "What's going on? You seem different." She shook her head, feeling the pressure of everything she had just realized. I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep pretending like I have everything figured out when all I've been doing is hiding from myself." Aarav's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his gaze. "Hiding? From what?" Meera swallowed hard, then met his eyes. There was no easy way to say this, no simple explanation for the revelation that had just struck her. but she owed him the truth. I've spent my whole life hiding behind this gift, trying to make sense of everyone else's hearts, but never my own. I thought if I could see the truth in others, I could somehow find the answers for myself. But I've been running away from something I didn't want to face. She paused, taking a shaky breath. I'm afraid, Aarav. I'm afraid that no one will ever love me for who I really am. Not for my gift, not for what I can see in them, but for me. Just me. The words tumbled out of her like an avalanche, each one carrying with it a weight of years of suppressed fear. And as she said them, something inside her began to shift. It was as if she was shedding layers of herself she had never realized were there, layers that had been holding her back, keeping her from truly living, truly loving. Aarav didn't speak right away. He stood there, his eyes fixed on her, processing what she had just confessed. For a long, tense moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared vulnerability hanging between them. Then, slowly, Aarav stepped forward. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he gently grasped it, his fingers warm against her skin. Meera, his voice faltered, and he seemed to be searching for the right words. I never knew that. I never knew you felt like that. You've always seemed so strong, so sure of yourself. I didn't realize how much you were carrying. The rawness in his voice made her heart ache. She had never truly seen him, not like this, not with the clarity that came with sharing their fears. I've been so scared of being alone, of not being enough for you, Aarav continued, his gaze never leaving hers. And that's why I've always held back, because I didn't know how to be with someone who could see me so completely. I didn't know how to love without ruining it. Meera's chest tightened as she listened to him, the realization hitting her with a force that left her breathless. You've been afraid of the same thing I have, she whispered, her voice soft but steady. Afraid of being too much for the other person to handle. Aarav nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. I think I've always been afraid of love, afraid of letting go. But hearing you say this, it makes me realize that maybe I've been holding on to the wrong things for too long. At that moment, something shifted between them. The walls they had both built, the fears they had been hiding behind, began to crumble. It wasn't a grand revelation or a sweeping change, but it was a start to something real, something honest. Meera squeezed his hand, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders, a lightness she hadn't realized she had been missing. I don't need you to fix me, Aarav, she said softly, her voice full of sincerity. I just need you to see me. To see me for who I am, not for my gift or my insecurities, but for me. Aarav's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Meera saw him not as a man trapped in his past, but as someone who was truly present with her, someone willing to share in the vulnerability of the moment. I see you, Meera, he whispered. And I'm not going anywhere. And in that fragile, perfect moment, they both understood. Love wasn't about fixing or being fixed. It wasn't about knowing everything or controlling everything. It was about being seen. And, finally, they were seeing each other, truly, deeply, without fear. And that was enough. For the first time, Meera felt like she was exactly where she needed to be.
Akumah Audiobooks.
Refer to the channel playlist for a better experience and close your eyes to let your imagination run wild. Subscribe.